Knowing this, let's move on to chapter 40. Now, 40 is where God continues with this address with Job, and this time he directly responds to Job's plea and explanation. After all the speeches and all the debates that we've gone through, God has spoken in profound ways, and now Job must respond to God's challenge. So Job 40 marks a shift. Job, in his sorrow and frustration, has questioned God's justice, but now, faced with God's overwhelming power and wisdom, he is confronted with a choice: either continue in his self-defense or humbly bow before the Creator. And in this chapter, God reveals his sovereignty in a way that shakes Job's understanding, and he calls Job to recognize that God's wisdom and purpose go far beyond anything of human comprehension. So, hi, welcome. So, yeah. And so let's, it's good to see you. All right, we are going to read chapter 40 together. So, the Lord said to Job, "Will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? Let him who accuses God answer him." Then Job answered the Lord, "I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more." And then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. "Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Would you discredit my justice? Would you condemn me to justify yourself? Do you have an arm like God's, and can your voice thunder like his? Then adorn yourself with glory and splendor, and clothe yourself in honor and majesty. Unleash the fury of your wrath. Look at every proud man and bring him low. Look at every proud man and humble him. Crush the wicked where they stand. Bury them all in the dust together. Shroud their faces in the grave. Then I myself will admit to you that your own right hand can save you. Look at the Behemoth, which I made along with you, and which feeds on grass like an ox. What strength he has in his loins, what power in his muscles of his belly. His tail sways like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are close knit, and his bones are tubes of bronze, his limbs like rods of iron. He ranks first among the works of God, yet his maker can approach him with his sword. The hills bring him the produce, and all the wild animals play nearby. Under the lotus plants he lies, hidden among the reeds in a marsh. The lotuses conceal him in their shadow. The poplars by the stream surround him. When the river rages, he is not alarmed. He is secure though the Jordan should surge against his mouth. Can anyone capture him by the eyes, or trap him and pierce his nose? All right. So, greetings, greetings from America. I'm glad you joined from India. Wow. In America it's early morning, so but yeah, there it's probably in the evening, huh? So, all right. So knowing this and what we read in chapter 40, let's look at it expositionally. We look at verses 1 through 2, and it says a final challenge from God. The Lord said to Job, "Will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? Let him who accuses God answer him." So God begins by asking a cutting question. Job, who has been questioning God for many chapters, is now asked whether he is willing to correct God himself. And this is the moment where Job is asked to stop defending himself and face the full weight of God's authority. And so there's this powerful image here that the Creator, that God who spoke the universe into existence, now stands in judgment, not of Job's sin, but of his understanding. So God challenges Job, can you, a finite human, truly correct the infinite God? So how often do we, like Job, find ourselves questioning God's decisions, And yet, in the end, God is the Almighty. He is the Sovereign One. And we, as finite beings, can only humble ourselves before His infinite wisdom. And so when faced with the unexplainableness of life, and we remember that God's wisdom is not always meant to be understood, but to be trusted. So verses 3 through 5 is about Job's humble response. He makes a brief response here in verses 3 through 5. It says, "Then Job answered the Lord, I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more." So here we see Job's immense response to God's challenge in a humble surrender. He's totally surrendered here. He acknowledges his unworthiness and puts himself in a position of silence before God. And so Job covers his mouth in humility. After all his protests and arguments, Job recognizes that his words have been too small and his understanding has been too limited. And Job's humility here is profound. In the face of God's infinite wisdom, all arguments completely fall silent. So Job realizes that his suffering, does not diminish God's greatness. So Job's response is it's a model for us. So when we are confronted with God's majesty, we should respond with humility and silence rather than pride and argument. So in times of trial or confusion, pause and recognize that sometimes the most honest response to be silent before God, trusting in His greater understanding. And that's all that we have to do sometimes. Verses 6 through 14 is about God's further challenge. Further challenges Job with verse 7, where he says, "Brace yourself, man, like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me." So here God issues another challenge to Job, to prepare himself for even more questions that will, test his understanding. And God calls Job to respond, but the questions he asks are not about justifying Job's actions. They are about Job's place in the vastness of creation. So God telling Job to brace himself like a man, this is a challenge of strength and resolve, but it is not one of arrogance. It's a challenge to face the weight of truth. And so God asks Job whether he has the strength or wisdom to do what God has done to govern the universe, to create life, and to offer the world with justice and wisdom, or to order it with justice and wisdom. And so God's question focuses on God's sovereignty. Are you able to do these things I do? Are you able to control the universe? And Job's suffering and our own brings us to moments where we try to defend our actions or try to just justify our feelings. But sometimes the better response is to recognize God's sovereignty and trust in His wisdom. So verses 15 through 24 is about the behemoth. Now this is an interesting creature. In verse 15 he says, "Look at the behemoth, which I made along with you, and which feeds on grass like an ox." So God turns Job's attention to the behemoth, a mighty creature that Job cannot tame or control. And some believe it refers to either a hippopotamus or an elephant, but it may also symbolize a massive, untamable creature that God has made. So it's not necessarily those creatures, but the behemoth is a creature of unimaginable size and power, and it's walking freely in the fields under God's care and control. So the behemoth's strength is from God, and the wilderness is ordained in God's will. So if God controls the wildest creatures, he controls our circumstances too. Even in our wildest struggles, we can trust that God is in control. So, do you feel out of control in your life? Reflect on how God is holding everything from the smallest blade of grass to the most powerful creatures. So yeah, verses 25 through 41 is about the Leviathan. Now, this is another creature that's amazing. Can you pull in the Leviathan with a fish hook, or or down its tongue with a rope? So God now brings Job's attention to the Leviathan here, another mighty creature that no human can tame or subdue. And now this imagery in the Leviathan is a fierce and powerful creature of the sea, and it's symbolizing the untamable and the uncontrollable focus of the world. So the Leviathan is the embodiment of the forces that humans cannot control at all, and yet God alone has power over them. So if God is sovereign over the fiercest creatures and the most chaotic forces, he is sovereign over your storms too. And so if you're facing something in life that feels untamable, remember, God holds all things in his hands, and he is greater than any storm. So some points of application. Number one, God's sovereignty is beyond our understanding. So Job 40 confronts us with the idea that God's plans and wisdom are not something we can always comprehend, and that's okay. Because when we encounter suffering or confusion, it's a reminder to trust God's sovereignty even when we don't understand the why. And number two is that the humility before God. Like Job's humility is the turning point of this chapter. He recognizes that the presence of God, all his arguments fade away then. And so in our own lives, we can learn from Job's humility. Instead of understanding ourselves or defending ourselves or questioning God, we can surrender and acknowledge that God is God. And so, number three, God's control over the untamable. So, just as God controls the behemoth and the Leviathan, he has authority over the wild circumstances of our lives. So you might be dealing with a wild situation that feels out of control. Remember that God is sovereign. He's in control. He holds even the fiercest of storms in his hands. So Job 40 shows us that when we come face to face with God's power, our words and defenses often fall silent. And Job recognizes that God's ways are beyond our understanding. And in that realization, Job found his peace. In our struggles, we may not get the answers that we seek, but we can comfort and find comfort in the fact that God is sovereign. He is in control of the behemoth, the Leviathan, every storm in our lives. And so when you're faced with untamable, uncontrollable, or just the unknown, remember this, that God has it all in his hands, and trust in his wisdom.